In other words, both offices are based on training, awareness raising, and commitment through the depth analysis of the current police situation from a multidisciplinary perspective. Apart from our central area, I like to indicate that to accomplish everything I have mentioned, we have a contact point network made by 66 point contact, spread at central and peripheral level, who work and collaborate with the area in its goal and duties. And on top of that, this area is cross-cutting and complements other existing areas which are also specific and specialized concerning the fight against gender-based violence, such as the Central Unit of Family and Women, when it comes to gender-based violence in the frame of relationship, also sexual violence and genital mutilation, and the Central Unit of Trafficking Human Beings, when it comes to trafficking human beings, especially forced prostitution and forced marriage. The Central Unit of Family and Women provides a comprehensive police response service for the treatment of gender-based violence, domestic crimes against sexual freedom, and those committed against minors. They are specialized in the function taking into consideration a closeness treatment through a joint action that includes prevention, attention, investigation, and protection, and through the rise of awareness with campaigns aimed at victims and citizens to make violence visible and encourage its reporting, and with master plan in school centers. The area has undertaken an internal protocol against gender violence to tackle gender-based violence when the abuser of the victim are law enforcement agents, focus on the coordination of measures to be taken concerning to the protection of the victim, such as weapon withdrawal, or to access to the databases related to gender-based violence. We work with other forms of gender-based violence, such as trafficking human beings, forced prostitution, forced marriage, and other domestic labor and forced begging. And with obstetric violence too, that is other form, kind of gender-based violence. I like to conclude by sum up that Policía Nacional has pioneered the creation of an exclusive, permanent, and specific area devoted to human rights and gender equality within within a police institution. And in order to achieve our objective, we count on 36 human rights and gender equality agents spread to the central and territorial levels. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for that, Commissioner Lopez. Thank you. Our next panelist will be Dr. Jenny Klugman. Dr. Klugman is Managing Director at the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security and Senior Advisor at the Stanford University Center for Gender Equality. She will address links to the Women, Peace and Security agenda, how our understanding of gender-based violence and criminal justice responses has changed over the years, and some future perspectives. Dr. Klugman, over to you.
Thank you so much, Maxine, and it's great to join you all here this morning. Sorry, I'm just in the process of sharing my screen. Unlike, I think, several others on the panel, I don't have the depth of practical experience, and I'm feeling rather inadequate. But what I'm going to do is take a step back, if you like, and talk more about the broader legal context, what we know from some of the academic work which has been done, and then finally I'll touch on some innovations that we've seen in the midst and the wake of the COVID pandemic, which I think in many ways are quite welcome in terms of prevention and response measures. So firstly, just to start with some of the basics in terms of the international legal framework, and I'll go over this fairly quickly because I'm sure that it's very well known to many of the participants. The good news is that the prohibition of violence against women is by now firmly established through international conventions and associated recommendations like CEDAW, a number of regional conventions in Latin America, in Europe, in Africa. Of course, the prohibition in the Sustainable Development Goals, to which the opening video alluded, and of course, kind of a range of tribunal decisions and rulings. And so a couple of points, I think, just to highlight here. And here, I'm very much focusing on intimate partner violence. I should clarify at the outset. And I think an important point to note here is the definition of such violence and the consensus around a broad definition, which includes not only physical and sexual violence, but also psychological and financial abuse. And you can see here the way in which that is elaborated. And then very importantly, the shift from intimate partner violence being regarded as a private issue, that within the family, within the household, part of life, to something which is a major public health problem, and for which governments are responsible and accountable, both to prosecute cases of violence where these occur, but also a duty of diligence to prevent violence as well. I, of course, won't go into the kind of relevant rulings and so on, but that's the kind of emerging picture. And I think this graph here symbolizes quite well the very rapid shift over the last kind of 4 decades in terms of legislative responses to violence. So this basically shows the number of countries with laws in place against violence. And you can see it went from pretty much 0 in the mid-70s to approaching about 160 now. Of course, there's a range of legislative approaches. Some cases criminalize, some do not. The definition of violence can differ, the conditions under which survivors are able to kind of report, whether there are limitations in terms of time and so on, all differ. But the overall picture is quite clear. I guess one caveat I should make, this graph implies linear progress, but of course progress is never linear. And I was reminded again yesterday of Russia, for example, reversing and decriminalizing domestic violence just a couple of years ago. So, of course, there are kind of shifts and so on behind these aggregate numbers. There's an interesting literature around why this comes about. CEDAW seems to have played an important role, and international women's movements in particular, and post-conflict negotiations also appear to provide a window for reform as well, but I won't dwell on those today. Alex, who's also on the panel from UNFPA, is going to speak much more to constraints and problems around reporting. But one thing, so I won't go into too much detail on this, but I did just want to remind everybody that the vast majority of women who do experience violence never report it to anyone, certainly not to the police, and typically not even to kind of friends and family. And so we can see here, this is work that I did earlier when I was at the World Bank, where we looked for a sample of 30 developing countries. A minority of women sought any help at all, and only 6% sought help from authorities like doctors, lawyers, and so on. These figures are very low for developing countries, but even in European countries, there's an excellent report by the Human Rights Commission, which also found very low rates of overall reporting. It was around 14% just a couple of years ago. And this is just my other slide on this topic, where we disaggregated the demographic health survey data, trying to understand why women were not reporting. And you can see here, there are different things going on. So in some cases, it's no use. Some cases it's green is because it's part of life. Red, fear of repercussions. Yellow is embarrassment. Of course, all of these factors can play into each other and exacerbate the non-reporting. So the picture today is that rates of intimate violence remain very high all around the world. So these are the current rates, not the lifetime rates. So the lifetime rates that we often hear cited, 1 in 3 approximately, relates to a woman's risk of experiencing violence in her lifetime. This is just violence in the previous 12 months. So the global average is around 12% or 1 in 8 women, but you can see here much higher rates in some countries, particularly fragile and conflict affected states, including Papua New Guinea, and much better records in other parts of the world. This is drawn here from our the Women, Peace and Security Index that we publish at Georgetown together with PRIO, the Peace Research Institute of Oslo. We're just working on the 3rd edition now. And intimate partner violence is one of the indicators that we use in this index. So here we're comparing by region. We have fragile states as well as developed countries. So WHO now has an excellent website with the most updated information there. So this raises the obvious question, do laws actually matter? We have persistently high rates of violence, although not always good data over time. So do all these laws and legislative reforms really make a difference? I have done some work on this with a colleague, Lee, and what we found, the good news is it actually did seem to make a difference, that the average prevalence of violence was significantly lower in countries that did have laws in place. The mechanism by which this happens is something which we investigate in the paper. Obviously, countries which have lower rates of violence may be more likely, of course, to introduce laws as well. But we do see the role of laws very importantly in playing a signalling role and making clear that violence is unacceptable in the society. And so controlling for levels of development and women's education and so on, laws really do seem to make a difference, but of course, as part of a multi-pronged approach. And then finally, just very quickly touching on the impacts of the COVID pandemic, and what the UN Secretary General referred to as the shadow pandemic of intimate partner violence, and very tragic and reports of rising rates of violence being experienced by women amidst lockdown, the increased tensions and hardship being associated by tens of millions of people around the world. So in that context, there actually have been a series of innovations. And in recent work with DLA Piper, we did a rapid review of what's been done. I don't have time to go into the details here, but you can see the sorts of innovations which we uncovered. And the basic point that I want to make here is that these were obviously important amidst a pandemic. So for example, increasing access to reporting and taking more innovative approaches there, expanding options for women who have survived violence in terms of escaping abusive relationships and fostering their economic independence, innovations on the law enforcement front, and of course tracking how effective these interventions are. These were obviously urgent and needed during the pandemic, but they may also hold promise for the future in terms of longer term needs for reform. So let me stop there, and thanks very much again.
Thank you so much, Jenny. Very, very interesting. Looking forward to discussing further with you in our discussion a bit later. The next panelist is Ms. Alexandra Robinson. Ms. Robinson works as the Global GBV Advisor for the Gender and Human Rights Branch of UNFPA headquarters. And she will speak to us about the work of the justice sector in the context of broader gender-based violence, multi-sectoral response and prevention. Ms. Robinson, Alex, over to you.
Thanks so much. I'll just wait for my slides to be shared before I start. Thanks so much. So firstly, I'd just like to acknowledge UNODC for hosting this event, which I think comes at a really important point in time, as we start to see increased backlash against gender equality and women's rights. I think standing together to continue the march, I think, is really important, and working with the criminal justice system is a critical mechanism to do just that. Maybe Magda, if we can go to the next slide. Thanks so much. So I know Jenny did in fact cover off on this. But what we know of estimations of data, prevalence data for intimate partner violence, is that 1 in 3 women will be subject or have been subjected to intimate partner violence in their lifetime. And here is just a very basic visualization of this. And what we can see here is that only 40% of those survivors seek any support, as Jenny also highlighted. And of those who seek support, only 6% approach formal services. So that means, and generally that will include your justice, social services, and health. So the proportion of women who are subjected to violence who actually access the criminal justice system is a very, very small portion of survivors. I think it's critical here to understand this, because if we are to see these numbers increase and we are to see increased accountability for perpetrators, this point of contact, whether it's the initial point of contact or repeated points of contact, are critical to get right. If we could just go to the next slide. Thanks so much. So in terms of strengthening those responses, it's really important to understand why women and girls don't report. So I know Jenny highlighted some of the data from the analysis of demographic health surveys, which have been conducted globally. It's also really UNFPA program across 119 different countries globally, and we have built up a depth of evidence and understanding of women's decisions not to report into criminal justice systems. And these include, for example, issues around fear and stigma, and even shame associated with violence, and particularly intimate partner violence. And this is really dictated by those harmful gendered and social norms that really tolerate, even normalize, violence against women and girls. These harmful gendered norms also infiltrate our structural and institutional our structural systems, institutions, creating a lack of trust of women and girls in those justice systems. And we see this particularly in places where there is conflict or peace building, and those systems of trust are fragile and being built. We also see this, for example, with Indigenous communities where there's been colonization or suppression. We also, I think, as Jenny also raised before, in situations where we don't have the right legal frameworks in place, where we don't have the right protections at the right time, or we don't have the right definitions, or we don't have the most expansive definitions that we need to have in place. We also know that in emergency situations, in humanitarian crises, and we see this most recently with COVID, and we see it increasingly as a result of climate change, a lack of access to justice systems, increasingly difficult for women to be able to access formal services at all. And maybe over to the next slide. Thank you. So I'll just throw up here the essential services package, which I'm sure many participants are already very familiar with. And this is a collaboration between UNODC, UNDP, WHO, UNFPA, UN Women, who really came together to support a package or support the development of guidelines for frontline responses to gender-based violence within a survivor-centered and coordinated framework. Now, perhaps if I stop very quickly here and talk to one key example of the way in which some of these, in the way in which the UN agencies such as UNODC have come together with UNFPA in delivering justice and policing from a gender transformative perspective. I'll talk to an example in Myanmar where UNODC and UNFPA have worked very closely together for 5 or 6 years now, working with police officers, and I believe this year have trained more than 1,700 police officers in the provision of GBV responses. Critical to that success of that partnership in Myanmar was really the expertise that UNODC bring around policing and procedures and prosecution, together with the expertise that UNFPA brought around the other sectors such as health, social services, as well as partnerships with a range of civil society organisations who were also frontline responders and could strengthen that referral system into policing and justice systems. UNFPA also worked with UNODC in partnership through these trainings to start to support police and justice systems to challenge their own pre-established institutional norms which prevailed around their attitudes to women and girls and intimate partner violence in particular. And we found this to be an extremely interesting process where many of the male police officers started to understand not only the women as victims as a result of violence or intimate partner violence, but also their fellow women police officers and how they may relate with them. And although during the pandemic, much of this was suspended, certainly there were online discussions with stakeholders to continue to support and coordinate those GBV responses, as well as a range of different social media campaigns. And that focus of that program has now had sufficient success that it's expanding out into prison systems. And maybe just to the last slide, please, Magda, thank you. So I think what's important in ending violence against women is not only understanding what a response should be and what it should look like, and how we ensure that that first point of contact with the police and justice system is the right response at the right time, but also how we integrate prevention into the work of policing and criminal justice systems, and in fact how we integrate that beyond the idea of deterrence. So I think it's really important to understand response and prevention and as part of a broader ecosystem in terms of ending violence against women. I'll just quickly make reference here to the Respect Framework, which again has been developed by a number of UN agencies to support a framework for guidance around prevention of violence. So we can also put the link to that guidance as well as the ESP into the chat if anyone's interested. But briefly to say that that key approach places women's safety and survivor-centered responses at the center of any kind of prevention programming. As we can see from this slide, response and prevention really forms part of a longer term or broader continuum. So swift, safe and strong responses for survivors will serve to support focused deterrence, obviously, but also increase trust in the broader community. So strong responses, for example, might include increased women in justice and policing, women's desks, safe spaces, or which are both auditory and visually confidential, if that's required, domestic violence courts, for example, or mobile courts to support women who are living in geographically isolated areas, digital processes for the provision of evidence in court so that survivors don't have to provide evidence in a context where they're face to face with their perpetrator. And in taking into account all of these different points, we ultimately work in the best way that we can to reduce re-victimization of survivors or victims, which is a really key reason why women don't proceed through the criminal justice system. And then we have this, the other area of intervention. So this is where women may have reported or even may not have reported, but our frontline police workers are able to identify possible problems. They're able to understand how to refer survivors to support, and that may include for counselling, social services, for health, for treatment, obviously, but also into housing support or family law. So ensuring that at every step of the way, we're supporting comprehensive and survivor-centered responses as a way to de-escalate violence or to mitigate the impact of violence and to prevent a pattern of violence or a reoccurrence of that violence. And finally, we move into primary prevention, which is much more much more around population-based social norm change. So this is where, we have community policing services, for example, who work as key influencers within a community to start to shift the norms around the normalization of violence and support increased help-seeking behaviour and slowly build that trust. I think under primary prevention as well is this process of self-reflection within or on gendered norms within institutions as a way of building those systems of trust. So I think having said all that, I will hand back to Max. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alex. Fascinating. We might come back to this slide later in the discussion. So unfortunately, we do not have Isabel Reguerena with us, but we are going to jump immediately to Marco Teixeira, who is the head of, hold on, I scrolled down. He's currently the program coordinator for UNODC in Mozambique. He will address the impact of COVID-19 on these issues and UNODC's specific approach. Over to you, Marco Teixeira.
Thank you, Maxine, and good afternoon from Vienna. Special thanks to my colleagues for organizing this Gender Equality Forum, and Mariam and Magdalena. Also, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation. Also, greetings to my colleagues of panel, very interesting panel, and let me start by trying to share my presentation now, and if someone can confirm that is being displayed.
Yes, we see it.
Thank you, Max. Thank you, Maxine. Basically, what I want to start is by looking at the UNODC mandate. And I think we are obviously a convention-based organization, and when we look at our part of our mandate and the conventions that you see displayed in the slide, there is a strong interlinkage with some of the topics of today's panel. And of course, they are relevant to have, obviously, this framework to address gender-based violence and also how criminal justice systems respond to it. I'm trying to put in one slide what is our work and trying to package in categories. I would start by saying that our work as UNODC will encourage in 5 different areas. From one side, we work on the aspects of institutional mechanisms to support the process of how the institutions, the countries, the legal systems react to gender-based violence. This is one niche of our areas of work. Second, we complement this with the creation and production of knowledge, products, and tools that actually facilitates the assimilation of contexts, of strategies and approaches to address gender-based violence. The third element is to work in the perspective of facilitating and support interagency cooperation in the sense of looking at integrity of the criminal justice systems and how the different agencies can contribute to address the needs of the victims and obviously to serve justice in a fair way. In the fourth element is in the aspects of capacity building, and in here is how we translate the point 2 that you saw, knowledge products, and its use to improve the skills, the knowledge, the technical capacities of different stakeholders across the line of the criminal justice, and also associate institutions that address gender-based violence aspects. And finally, and I would not minorize these aspects, the awareness raising aspects. And I match it with the communication element, which means to ensure these topics are obviously always seen at the policy making, intergovernmental processes, in the policy making at national levels, but also are not overlooked when looking the overall function of the criminal justice system. Basically, continue the strong social awareness around those topics. I will try to move a little bit looking at the impact of basically what happened in the COVID-19 and how this impacts the system and the functional of criminal justice system. I will start clearly with the assumption that the priorities were shifted. Obviously, there is other emergency priorities that might have overlooked the importance, the prioritization of cases linked with gender-based violence. This is the first risk and the first impact analysis from our side. The second element, the transition to what we can call a e-justice system. Obviously, the courts need to adapt, which they are tailored to have face-to-face interactions, to adapt to the new realities, and this might have created some backlog and some delays on the justice being served. And as we all know, justice that is being delayed is justice that is not being served. So this is also an impact that we see. Also, from the perspective of social and economical impact, women have been more affected than men by several reasons that actually are escalating the victimization risks, are more vulnerabilities towards violence and crime. And obviously in the last part, in the right side of the slide, and I think the matrix speaks by itself, 1 in each 3 faces the risk of experiencing some form of sexual or other forms of violence that victimize women. And another aspect is also with the constraint of movements, with the confinements. This always creates a new platform to avoid, for one side, the reporting of those cases that are also very low by nature, and we have listened this to before, and also exponentialize the risk for having a killing by one of the inner cycle, I would say, either partners, either close family members. And obviously victims are more or less, women are more statistically predominant. And this is a little bit what we see from our side. Now, moving to the next slide, what we have tried to do, or at least some of our areas of work, we can discuss a little bit later on during our question and answers part. From one side, we continue to work with a practical list of recommendations to different criminal justice actors, continue this dialogue and assist them in the way they can try to adapt to the new realities and mitigating risks. The second point, also work with the governments and to try to identify what are the policy changes or practical changes on procedures that can reduce these vulnerabilities that we have described before, and try to also address the gender needs associated with these victims of violence. Another part that I want to raise and bring to the table is continue the educational setting exercise from UNODC side, which means that we produce some educational tools and resources that work with the educational sector, and they are designed to work with the educational sector to construct the value system of young women and obviously children, because this construct of values will allow them to be more perceptive of how to report, what is an acceptable conduct and what is not an acceptable conduct that violates their integrity as women and as young girls. And so our work is to work on changing this paradigm on the way that women see themselves, and I would say try to deconstruct some paradigms and some stereotypes. Also, I'm going to give you 3 examples that are in the slide. One is a cartoon series that's called Zorbs, that has also educational angle to teach children about aspects linked with the gender-based violence. And we have other resources that also include board games, lessons plans, etc. And finally, in a specific example, we have worked with UN Women, an International Association of Women Police, to create and develop a new handbook on gender responsible police, on policing, I would say, in that sense. So this is a little bit from my side, my 5 minutes of introduction. There are a few more details UNODC is working on, but for now, I will hand over back to you, Maxime, and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marco. We assure you we'll come back to you during the discussion. We are now going to shift to the panel discussion. I'd like to let you all know, first of all, that we have 143 participants, which is very exciting. And to welcome everyone to please send any questions you have in the question and answer box function, which you can find on the bottom right of your screen. We will be first having a panel discussion, and then after that, we will take questions and answers from the participants. We'll do our best to cover as many as we possibly can. So with that, I'd like to put out the first question, and I'm going to direct the first question to Jenny and then hope that other panelists will also jump in. So Jenny, can you tell us a little bit more about what legal changes you believe need to be made, and how can those changes, legal changes, be accompanied by broader cultural changes in attitudes and beliefs? If you could give some specific recommendations along with your comment, that would be much appreciated. Jenny?
Well, thank you, Max. I mean, it's difficult to generalize because I think different countries are in different places, and the ways in which implementation may fall short ranges as well across countries. I mean, you know, the starting point clearly is the prohibition of violence and definitions of violence, which include sexual as well as physical violence with respect to intimate partner violence. It's also clear that limitations and obstacles to reporting should be minimized as far as possible. You know, so there are countries where, for example, it's limited to 30 days, or there are additional evidentiary requirements which make reporting more difficult and more onerous. And I'm sure that you and others on the panel have more practical takes on this as well. I think the other important point, and this was very much underlined by Alexandra as well, is to see legislative reform as a piece of the puzzle, you know, a very important piece of the puzzle, but even in the best of circumstances, many and, you know, almost invariably most women are not going to be reporting for a variety of reasons. So for me, that really puts the emphasis on prevention, you know, rather than response, and to ensure that we be thinking about ways in which risk factors, you know, are addressed, and that norms ensure that violence is not acceptable under, you know, under any circumstances in the home, and to be setting those both at the highest level in terms of political leadership, but also I think very importantly we've learnt from innovative work, you know, SASA and interventions which have taken place at the grassroots level, the very important work with communities and with local leaders and so on. But let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenny. I think there's obviously a lot of experience that can be shared between these different sectors. I think we can learn a lot from what you've done in terms of evaluating intimate partner violence. And I was wondering if Lola could come in and give us some examples. I think, Lola, if I understood you correctly, you talked about an internal protocol that the Policía Nacional has developed for to deal with law enforcement responses to gender-based violence perpetrated by law enforcement officers, if I'm not mistaken. Could you give us some thoughts on some particular concrete strategies that you have put in place to support survivors in reporting, whether for intimate partner violence or for violence perpetrated as serious human rights violations? Could you tell us some examples, please, that we might take as recommendations for other jurisdictions?
Thank you very much. Yes, you were right. The area of human rights and gender equality in which I work, we thought it was very important and crucial to undertake and to count with an internal protocol against gender-based violence when the abuser or the victim or both are law enforcement agents, because we thought in this way we provide that other citizens trust in us, because if we don't address properly our own cases of gender-based violence within our institution, why do the victim can trust us? For that, we made the protocol, adopt some measure, that common measure, such we thought it was very important, the weapon withdrawal or the access to databases related to gender-based violence, because sometimes we could find some police officer who was an author of gender-based violence crime who was working in that unit, and this is intolerable, unacceptable. So we withdraw the police officer from there. And we provide to the victim, as the victim that are not police officer too, a comprehensive information concerning their rights is entitled with highlighting those which help to provide a better protection and security. As I mentioned before, I'm not sure I mentioned, we come with a very protective normative rules. Is our Ley Orgánica 1004 that protect the victims and create a framework that put on the top of that the prevention, not only the reaction when a crime is committed. It's very important, the prevention, and to support the victim after the crime is committed. So we have a police officer who work with the protection of the victim. They are their liaison, and they provide any measure and any things they need. They are permanently in touch with the victim, control possible risk situation, monitoring the evolution of the victim risk situation, and adequate control of area of daily life of woman and the aggressor, and encourage the victim to report aggression and judicial breach carried out by the aggressor. Because what we learn is if the victim comes to us and report she is a victim of gender-based violence, and we don't provide them the support they needed, they don't trust in us anymore. And the first step is very important. As Alessandra mentioned before, they have to find a police officer that provides all the support they needed. But after that, it's not only the moment of the report, it's what it can before. And we advise, assist, and accompany the victim in police and judicial procedure. And all this process is provided by a police officer. And as we as national police do with the victims that are not police officers, we do the same with our own victims. I hope that I am explaining. I give to you all the experience and the samples I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lola. Yes, very, very interesting. I think we're already developing a list of concrete recommendations that we could gather together and refer to later. Alex, I think it's important for you to jump in here as well. Perhaps, we're talking about different ways to contribute to prevention and to help victims and survivors come to report and support them in the process. And perhaps you could give a few more examples about certain strategies that you would recommend concretely that we can do in terms of that first point of contact, because you were talking about how critical that initial contact is, and that sort of paves the way toward access to justice after that or blocks it. And so perhaps you could dive a little deeper into some suggestions.
Thanks, Max. I can certainly try, and I feel like other panelists are touching on bits and pieces as we go. But first of all, I think Jenny raised it when we spoke about different countries operating in different ways, and I think in terms of prevention and increased access into justice systems, really ensuring that we have that granular understanding at a local level and even a subnational level, because I think it's highly variable. I also think that the engagement of CSOs cannot be underestimated in grassroots organizations. That is where victims and survivors place their trust in general. They, being part of a group of women, can be an indicator of a high resistance to violence, which then demonstrates a level of trust within that group. And I think if when we're talking about broad-based trust within communities and social norm change, that relationship between CSOs and policing and criminal justice systems more generally, I think is really important. And certainly we see that in peace building and conflict areas, certainly through mechanisms where we're reporting conflict-related sexual violence, for example. Doing that in partnership with CSOs is absolutely critical. I know Jenny also spoke to SASA and some of those primary prevention programs, where we do have an evidence base for decreasing prevalence of violence. And I think it's really important that we do have all the sectors of response engaged as influencers in that process, and understanding what, as we spoke about that ecosystem of response and prevention, ensuring that as part of those prevention programs and making sure that they're safe and effective, that we have those strong linkages into response, and that includes certainly having police who understand the context. They have taken time to understand their own prejudices, which often are very difficult to identify without facilitated support. We are still struggling in many countries around this idea that women report rape immediately. Very often women don't report rape immediately, or that men don't rape their wives, or sex is a primary motivation for rape. I think just even around this offense of rape and sexual violence, the myths and the prejudices that different people within that system bring is phenomenal. And I think until we can really start to understand and unpack some of those and start to move people beyond that, and that includes people in the community, but as well as within criminal justice systems, I think that is critical and foundational in our work. Thanks, Max.
Thank you, Alex. Yes, I'm wondering, Marco, if you can jump on this issue of changing the thought process, changing the thinking, changing these myths. And specifically, you spoke about capacity building as one of the programmatic areas. I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about how UNODC is working on capacity building and educational models that help shift the discussion, some best practices or some examples of some capacity building strategies that UNODC is engaging in to tackle some of the challenges that Alex and the others were talking about. Marco?
Thank you, Maxine, for this. I don't want to simplify with my examples a very complex issue, but I want to give some insights of what is our approach and what we have been doing. First, we need to understand that the criminal justice system is very process-driven and formalized-driven. So the linkage that was broken on the confidence of the victim to the society that failed to protect her, it is unfortunately not the first concern of the system itself. So we need to change this paradigm and try to get a more victim-centered approach criminal justice system, which means that reconstructing this social bond that was broken is as important as following the procedures and the legal procedures to get the criminal case going and properly prosecuted and obviously adjudicated and sentenced if it is the case. So this is the initial caveat, is to continue to build the soft skills of police officers, of prosecutors, of judges, of different parts of the criminal justice system that can be more efficient on addressing what are also the victim's needs that might not only be the formal process needs. So this is one angle that obviously UNODC continues to build resources and efforts in terms of creating this capacity and shifting this paradigm. On the second element that I want to raise and I want to mention, and going back into the system, is actually deconstructing these gender-related stereotypes that sometimes hinder or can catalytic be pushing persons and victims not to report. Which means that we need to start, as I mentioned, in a value system and find ways to teach young women, young children, what is their individuality represents and what does the state has the obligation to legally protect. Because obviously the legal anchorage is associated with the self-perception of who I am as a person, who I am as a woman. So we need to continue to work with the young generations, with some of the education resources that we have, in a very simple way to deconstruct these topics who are very complex to explain to the child that is in a primary grade, but we are able to produce some resources that were peer review, pedagogical, adapted to those age groups and try to roll up that. And then I will move to the third example, which is very far away in the criminal justice system, which is building up the rehabilitation process. There is obviously the prison system and the penitentiaries are built for the main population, and the main population are male dominated, which means the system is trying more to focus on addressing the needs of the male population. And sometimes the gender associated needs of female persons privated of freedom are not in the front line of the policy priorities. So what we try to do is also to build and work with the member states to have rehabilitation programs with women to try to build up their rehabilitation capacity to be social productive when they finish their sentences. And actually we have a very good example on Bolivia that I actually like personally. So we have a program on Bolivia with 50 women that were in prison, and we have rolled up a formalized training course in prison settings that allows them to be employable in the construction sector, which is very strange because it's a sector that theoretically in some countries is male dominated. But our assessment of the labor market in Bolivia was that the female employees were very demanding to the finalize and fine tuning on constructions aspects, while the male was dominating the more heavy lifting work. It is a stereotype, but it's what the market and employability is, to build the skills of those women when they are outside of the prison to be able to be employed. They were certified by the Ministry of Education. They were, hopefully, with most of them, they are working for the state of Bolivia in the rehabilitation of other prison settings outside of the prison, and they are being paid for that. So I think it's a good example why we try to adapt and provide technical assistance in the niche area that's also important to be gender inclusive, I would say, in the criminal justice system. Thank you.
That's an excellent example, Marco, and thank you for addressing those three separate areas. I'd like to ask a question. I'm going to ask you to put your hand up, panelists, for who wants to answer it first. This question is about partnerships. And I think the question is about who might we be overlooking in our efforts to build partnerships? What public-private partnerships should we be looking for? I think Marco's example was actually quite a good example of, let's say, creative partnership that can have quite a long-lasting impact. So can any of you share any examples of partnerships that we might not normally think of in our work, but which have contributed to improvements in gender equality and in addressing prevention for gender-based violence? Who would like to take it before I name you? Marco, are you nodding? Please take it.
Thank you, Maxim. I don't want to manipulate neither. It's a UNODC event, but the other colleagues are very welcome to speak. I don't want to be seen.
No problem. No
we
problem.
are both, but we are glad to have you here. Two examples. I think one thing that we could be potentially consider even more, even with some constraints, is the private sector, either in different angles of the private sector. It is sometimes complex to work with the private sector by different limitations of statutory laws, etc. But there is social responsibility of a lot of companies that can be of added value on finding creative solutions for prevention. I'm going to give you a specific example. The hackathons that we partnered with Facebook and other tech companies were a good example of trying to identify ways to report gender-based violence with our young generation that were participating on those hackathons. So I think it's sometimes difficult to partner, but it's something that we should not overlook. And the second example is obviously looking at the post-release package of women that are in conflict with the law and one reason or another were having a sentencing, trying to find the private sector to absorb those capacities and employable capacities of those women upon release. It's something that we should potentially continue to consider, or even try to capitalize on these public-private partnerships. This is my reflection. Thank you.
Max, I can add briefly. There are, just to pick up on Marco's points, I think there are also interesting examples in the context of COVID responses and partnerships with the private sector, you know, using empty hotel rooms and taking up some of that excess capacity. I mean, obviously, it may not be totally altruistic from the private sector's point of view, but it did create opportunities, I think, possibly for the longer term. A different example that I wanted to highlight was that of Tostan, which is the group which worked with local religious leaders in West Africa and parts of the Horn and so on, local Islamic leaders. It's more actually in the context of female genital mutilation and changing norms around that practice. But I think UNICEF in particular has been kind of supportive of those efforts. And again, there have been evaluations to show its effectiveness. And then finally, but not least, although it's not new and it's rather obvious, but I think it's worth underlining the importance of partnership with women's groups. And one point that I neglected to mention on the role of laws, one aspect that we often see falling short is actually funding. So it's funding for implementation, but it's also funding for non-governmental organizations, community groups who may be involved in delivering services. They may be involved in advocacy, you know, protection and so on, and very much on the front lines. And we saw that obviously in the context of COVID, but we see it across the board. So whilst it's not new, it's a perennial issue, and women's groups have been working hard on these fronts. I think it would be remiss of us to not mention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenny, for jumping in. Would anyone else like to add to this particular issue before we move to the next question?
I would like to jump in.
Please, Lola,
Maxine.
yes.
I was talking before about the area of human rights and gender equality, and one of our pillars in the function and the goals we want to aim is establishing and maintaining relationship with other relevant organizations and institutions, public or private sector, to promote cooperation and best practice within a multi-layered approach in human rights and gender equality and gender-based violence. In Spain, going back to what Alessandra said before, that the report of the crime maybe is not the more important thing. We need to encourage women to report the crimes they are suffering. In Spain, you can obtain the full social service support without reporting the crime. This is very, very important because we learn that many victims, after reporting the crimes they suffer, they quit the report in the police station, in the judge. So it's very important, it's crucial. They raise the awareness and to encourage them to the process they are going through. And we count with the call center, is the social service system that works or are available 24 hours or every day of the year. So they can call. It was very helpful in the COVID-19 situation when victims couldn't go out to the police station or the street, because when they find themselves in a very risky situation, they could call to this service system. They are connected with the police station too. This is very, very important. I think this is the way the police need to work to fight against gender-based violence crime, to be coordinated with every institution, because if we are not coordinated, the needs of the victim aren't fulfilled in this way. Thank you very
Maybe
much.
Max, if I could,
Yes,
if I could
I was going to
comment.
ask you, Alex, please go ahead.
I agree with all of the partnerships that have been raised around, you know, increased partnership between public, private, religious leaders. I also think there's scope for, and I know we do already do a lot of work with informal justice systems, but understanding what those systems are often define how and why women do or don't access formal systems. So I think there's, you know, really key areas there that we can understand better, and often, you know, we do have religious leaders engaged in those processes. So I think that's also a partnership we need to understand. I would also add in national statistics offices as well. I think, you know, while we might understand our justice system or justice information management systems or our health information management systems, we have less understanding about how effective the referrals are between the systems of response. So how well social services or health are referring into the police, or police referring back the other way. So starting to understand how that system is operating and functioning. So effectively multi-sectoral administrative data systems, I think is another area of partnership that that could start to give us an understanding of what is effective, what isn't, and again, that really granular detail, I think, down to that subnational level, or is really important here. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. I think we have a very long list of recommendations already. Okay, I'm going to turn to the Q&A. We have some superb questions that have come in. I might not be able to get all of them in, but I'm going to try my level best, okay? So the first question I'll start with is this. Regarding access to services, a major hindrance to reporting, an obstacle to access to justice here in Africa, is that services remain largely inaccessible to geographically isolated areas. For example, rural women from nomadic communities and migrating pastoralist communities. In remote areas, they are cut off even from rape crisis centers. So here's the question. Has UN Women, or I guess do any of you from any UN agency or institution, academic or otherwise, know of any study that compared access for gender-based violence or intimate partner violence of women victims in urban areas versus those in rural areas in any particular country?
Max, I'm happy to take that one quickly and then pass to the other panelists. Part of the, and I hope I can try and answer some of the question here, but part of the work that UNFPA have been doing is we have an intimate partner violence dashboard, and in there is contained all of the rates of or the prevalence of IPV over the past over lifetime, and one of my colleagues has just placed it into the chat box for everyone. But in there, the data is broken down into subnational areas where you can start to maybe see some of that breakdown between urban and rural areas, which may be helpful. I think when I spoke before about multi-sectoral administrative data systems, I think once those systems are in place, where and how that data starts to emerge and is analysed can most definitely be broken down geographically. And we do have many examples in globally where we do have that, particularly in humanitarian responses where we have GBV information management systems. Thanks, Max.
Yes, can any of the other panelists respond on this question as well? Would anyone else like to speak to it?
I mean, I'm not
Jen.
sure, and I'm not aware of any evaluations, but just to throw out that some of the innovations that we've seen around COVID in terms of reporting and platforms and apps which have been developed may well be kind of fruitful avenues for the future. I think that our colleagues on the law enforcement side, and I guess on the legal side as well, would need to comment on how robust those systems would need to be. But it seems to me that some of the experimentation and rapid innovations that have taken place might warrant further consideration to see whether or not they might also work in the settings of women who are remote and marginalised more generally, and not just in the context of lockdown. Thank you.
Yes, Lola.
I like to add to that Alessandra and Jenny mentioned that we count with great statistics in Spain that meet all the calls that provide from the or comes from from the social system, and we carry out surveys that demonstrate that women from rural background, elderly women, and women with disabilities are more vulnerable to gender-based violence, and they don't report the crimes they suffer to the police. So we are focused on these issues because they are more vulnerable because of the things Alessandra mentioned before, the reason why women not report the crimes they are suffering, the fear, the stigma, the shame, the lack of trust, and these reasons are stronger in this background, in the rural background, and with women with disability. We launched a handbook to deal with women with disabilities and elderly women who have suffered gender-based violent crime, because they need a different needs. They have different needs to be treated, to be accompanied, and to be supported. This is the thing. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Lola. Yes, excellent, excellent. Okay, I'm going to quickly move on to another question that we've been asked. In the case of interventions with men and others who have perpetrated domestic or intimate partner violence, pardon me one second. What innovative advances in practice, oh my goodness, these notes are popping up. What innovative advances in practice, local or global, would be of interest to law enforcement, criminal justice practitioners, researchers, and policymakers? So we're talking about interventions with men and others who have perpetrated domestic or intimate partner violence. Can any of you speak to that? Lola says no. Marco, can you? Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Maxime. Not sure if I'll address fully the deep of this question, which goes in very, I would say, complex details. One thing from my perspective and our perspective is the focus should go on reducing the reoffending. Because by nature, and I think the colleagues on this panel might have even more, I would say, academic background that prove that reoffending of cases of intra-house gender-based violence are very common, which means that the focus of the system is also to prevent this reoffending. So which could be an avenue to explore in the future is, besides of the common sentencing on financial sentencing, privation of liberty, could be also the re-education psychological factor of persons that are in risk of reoffending, which means that potentially the avenue is to change the behavior. And change the behavior also as a consequence of the criminal justice process. But I will leave it here. It's very complex and very interesting question, but this is a little bit my initial reflection. Thank you.
Anybody else want to comment on that before I move to another question?
As national police, we haven't had any experience in this matter, in the intervention with perpetrators, but it seemed to me a great ocean. We have thought to do it because I think to end with gender-based violence is very important to address the men and the young through training and through the intervention with them. But this is the thing we haven't tried yet.
Thank you. So you see the recommendations, we can all take lessons from this and try to apply it in our work. I'll move to another question. Somebody asks, I would be interested in learning if and how insights from behavioral sciences are being considered to improve the access to justice for girls and women, and for designing initiatives aimed at preventing and combating violence against women. Jenny?
Well, I can have a bit of a shot at this. I mean, I think that there are important insights from behavioral sciences. I think in particular around reducing obstacles reporting and the ease of reporting, changing kind of frames of thinking and norms. And so whilst it's not, if you like, a nudge intervention, I think that kind of more general norms or broader norms in the society around kind of the roles of women, women in leadership, the unacceptability of violence, you know, what sporting heroes and heroines do, what political leaders do, all play an important role in creating the frame, I think, and the defaults in which we all operate. So I think that's an important point to make. I think that there probably are more specific aspects that can be undertaken. I worked with Vic Health for several years in the state of Victoria, together with Professors Ira Bonet, and we focused more on the labour market side, but I recall having some interesting discussions there around, for example, police recruitment, that despite concerted efforts, it was difficult to get women kind of into the pipeline and through, and they're looking at ways in which the structure of kind of interview processes and selection could be reformed in order to reduce unintended biases in the way that those systems operated. And then a final point to make, where I think behavioural sciences can also bring insights, which is also very important, is around bystander interventions, and what people who witness violence or the risks of violence might do in order to either prevent or report, as well as to provide support to survivors. So I think there's certainly a rich field here. It's not as amenable as getting people to pay their taxes or the utility bills and some of the things that we typically think about in the context of behavioural sciences. But it's a major public health problem, and I think there are important ways in which we can be bringing these insights into changing the way people behave, because I think the important point is that the laws are in place, but the behaviours are not necessarily changing, and so that's why I think there is a lot to learn from behavioural sciences. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. So we are running out of time. What I'm going to say is that the other amazing questions which are being sent, which we haven't had time to address, will be addressed in the outcome document that will be published in September. So you will not go unanswered or unresponded to. The final question I have, and I'm going to put it to each of the panelists. You have 10 seconds, okay, maybe not 10 seconds, maybe 20 seconds to answer. And I'm going to go in reverse order. So Marco, since you were last, I'm going to put you first. This is the final question. What key actions should UNODC focus on in the next 5 years? Marco?
Thank you, Maxime, but maybe a little bit more than 20 seconds. But I will go in point one in terms of recommendations. Continue this holistic intervention and coordinated intervention with a focus also in local contexts to support, obviously, a victim-centered justice system to address gender-based violence. This will be recommendation one. Recommendation two, if I may, also promote and try to conceptualize how to support the member states and institutions on adequate protection measures, because this will also reinforce the efficiency of the criminal justice system and also the reconstruction of the social link that was violated with that offense. And finally, and one point from my side, the educational sector and awareness raising. Obviously, we need to continue to work with the educational sector, merging three important SDGs, which is the SDG 5 on gender, the basis of this, SDG 4 on quality education, and SDG 16, which are also the three umbrellas that we can work on the education for rule of law. I would put it like this. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Marco. Well done. Alex?
I'm really struggling, but I think probably, and I think you've probably raised some of them already, but I think, the partnership, when I spoke to the ecosystem of response and prevention, I think squarely, placing the work of UNODC within that ecosystem with CSOs and women's-led organizations, including, LGBTQI organizations and organizations representing women with disabilities. So I would say, I think that is critical. I think that's also critical in terms of what my second recommendation would be, which is really around the work around social norm change and and not just as a partner in broader community social norm change, but also internally, not internal to UNODC, but institutional social norm change and challenging some of those unintended biases. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Excellent. So Jenny, what key actions should UNODC focus on in the next 5 years?
Well, I agree with those which have been said, so I won't waste my 10 seconds on those ones. But just to add an additional point, I think a valuable contribution could be very much kind of bringing together the good practices around criminal justice and what's worked, but also what hasn't worked. So being frank about efforts which, however well-intentioned and even well-resourced, didn't manage to bring off the hoped for results. Because I think through that learning and sharing across UN agencies, across governments and other stakeholders, we can move forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenny. Lola, you're the last word.
Yes. I'm going to be brief and I'm going to repeat all they said. I will say first, prevention. Engaging all relevant sectors in the fight against gender-based violence. Second, highlighting education and awareness. And third, fostering the use of the gender perspective in any action taken to avoid any kind of discrimination. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everybody. It's been an absolute pleasure and inspiration to speak with all of you. And I'm going to hand the floor back to Hannah.
Thank you, Maxime. And I just want to say that I feel spoiled. I'm so happy that we had the opportunity to organize these panels over these days, because I feel I learn a lot, and I hope fellow attendees and participants feel the same. So thank you for sharing your insights and expertise, and it surely will enrich the recommendations that we are developing. And also a special thank you to Maxine for a fantastic job of moderating. So hope to see you all tomorrow for the last panel on organized crime. And with that, I wish you all a great day ahead. Thank you.